Eleanor Whitaker pressed both hands flat against the smokehouse door and refused to move. Behind her, 3 ranch hands were shouting for her to step aside. In front of her, the fire she had spent 4 days building was still burning, the only fire on a dying ranch that hadn't gone cold since September. Her shoulders were shaking. Her boots were splitting at the seams. She had not slept in 36 hours. But she did not move. "You want this ranch to survive winter," she said quietly, without turning around. "Then you let me do my job." If this story already has your heart, I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and follow this channel so you never miss a single story. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I read every one of them, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Eleanor. The letter arrived at Black River Ranch on a Tuesday, tucked inside a feed order that nobody had actually paid for yet. Nathaniel Carter read it standing up the way he did, everything with his jaw set and his eyes moving fast across the page. Not because he was in a hurry, but because he had learned a long time ago that bad news didn't get easier the slower you read it. The letter was from the Territorial Supply Company out of Billings. It said they were cutting his credit line, effective immediately. He folded the paper twice, and pushed it into his coat pocket. He walked out of the barn and stood at the edge of his own property and looked at what was left of it. The cattle were down to 1/3 of what he'd run the year before. 2 of his 4 ranch hands had quit in October, right before the first hard frost, because they'd heard rumors that Black River wouldn't make it through the season, and they didn't want to be standing on a dead man's land when winter arrived in full. The smokehouse, the one thing that was supposed to protect the ranch's food stores through the cold months, hadn't been operational in 3 years. The man who used to run it, an older hand named Gus, had died the winter before last, and nobody had bothered to learn what Gus had known, because everybody assumed Gus would always be there. Gus wasn't there anymore, and winter was coming. He hadn't told his hands about the letter. He wouldn't tell them, not directly, not yet. But men who worked land could read a man who worked land, and they had all known something was coming. He had seen it in the way they looked at each other across the supper table, the particular silence of people who have decided not to say the thing they're all thinking. It was the silence of a ship taking on water, and a crew that hasn't quite decided whether to start bailing or start looking for lifeboats. He respected them too much to pretend. That night after supper, he sat them down at the table, Dale Tobias Clement, and a younger hand named Roy, who had shown up looking for work in August, and who Nathaniel had kept on because he worked hard and asked good questions, and reminded him faintly of himself at 20. "We're short on provisions," Nathaniel said. He put his hands flat on the table, which was a habit of his when he was being direct. "The smokehouse hasn't run in 3 years. I'm going to hire someone to run it. Someone who knows the work." Dale looked up. "Where are you going to find someone like that before the cold hits town?" Nathaniel said. "This time of year," Clement said. He wasn't being contrary. Clement never was. He was being practical, which was the same thing in different clothes. "I don't have another option," Nathaniel said. None of them argued with that, because it was true and they all knew it, and there was nothing useful to say after a true thing that hard. Roy, the youngest, cleared his throat. "You need me to come with you into town?" "No," Nathaniel said. "I'll go alone." He went alone. Nathaniel Carter had exactly 2 choices. He could sell the cattle he had left, settle what debts he could, and ride away from Black River the way his wife had ridden away from it, not on horseback, but in a pine box, with nothing resolved and nothing finished. Or he could find someone who knew how to cure and smoke enough pork to carry 12 people through 5 months of Montana winter. He chose the second option. Not because he was optimistic, because he was too stubborn to be anything else. He rode into the nearest town on a Wednesday morning, tied his horse outside the general store, and posted a notice on the board near the entrance. He kept it short because he didn't believe in wasting words. Help wanted. Smokehouse work. Knowledge of meat curing required. Inquire at Black River Ranch, ask for Carter. He expected to wait a week. He expected to interview 2 or 3 experienced men, compare their references, and hire the one who asked for the least money. What he did not expect was to come out of the general store 20 minutes later and find a woman sitting on the bench outside, reading his notice, with a calm, deliberate expression, like she was working through a recipe she'd already memorized. She was not what anyone would call a conventional frontier woman. She was heavy, not just fuller than the narrow-waisted women in the fashion plates his late wife used to cut from magazines, but genuinely, solidly, unmistakably large, in a way that the men loitering near the hitching post clearly felt entitled to have opinions about. She had dark brown hair braided neatly over one shoulder, a coat that had been mended more than once at the elbows, and the kind of stillness in her face that came not from passivity, but from long practice at not giving other people the reaction they were fishing for. She looked up when he stopped in front of her. "You're Carter," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he said. "I'm Eleanor Whitaker." She folded the notice and held it out to him. "I can run your smokehouse." He looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who made fast judgments, or so he told himself, but there was something in that moment, some old and stubborn reflex that made him hesitate. He had expected someone different. He had expected someone who looked the part, whatever that meant. "You've done this kind of work before?" he asked. "My father ran a smokehouse in Indiana for 22 years, she said. "I worked beside him from the time I could carry a cord of wood. I know hickory smoke. I know brine ratios. I know how to control temperature without a thermometer. And I know how to read meat the way some people read the weather." She paused. "I also know that you're low on time, Mr. Carter. The first real cold front is 3 weeks out, maybe 4. If you want cured pork on those hooks before it hits, you need to start now." He stood there another moment. Then he said, "Come out to the ranch tomorrow morning. I'll show you the smokehouse." He did not say the word yes, but she heard it anyway. She arrived at Black River the next morning before he did, which he discovered when he walked out to the smokehouse at 6:30 and found her already standing in front of it, hands on her hips, studying the building with the focused expression of a surgeon examining a patient before deciding where to cut. The smokehouse was not in good shape. It hadn't been in good shape for 3 years, and Nathaniel knew it, which was part of why he felt a particular low-level humiliation standing next to this woman while she looked at the wreckage of his neglect. The firebox had rusted through on one side. 2 of the hanging rods had come loose from the ceiling and were leaning against the far wall at an angle that made them useless. The vents were warped, which meant temperature control would be nearly impossible until they were repaired, and the whole structure smelled like rot and old smoke, and something else underneath it, something almost sweet that Nathaniel couldn't identify. Eleanor walked in without waiting for him to invite her. She ran her hand along the wall near the firebox. She crouched down and looked at the base of the hanging rods. She stood and pressed one palm flat against the ceiling above the vent and held it there for a moment like she was checking for a pulse. "When did you last burn anything in here?" she asked. 3 years, he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You've got good bones," she said finally. "The structure is sound. The firebox needs a new plate on the east side. I can work around it in the meantime if you can't get the metal right away. The rods I can rehang myself. The vents are going to be the hardest part." She turned and looked at him directly. "I need coarse salt. Not fine, not iodized coarse. Good hardwood, ideally hickory. But if you can't get hickory, I'll tell you what else I'll accept. And I need to be left alone to work." Nathaniel looked at her. That's it. You don't need more hands, more equipment. I need those 3 things," she said evenly. "What I don't need is people standing in the doorway second-guessing me while I'm trying to control a fire." He almost smiled. He didn't, but he almost did. "All right," he said. He did not ask her what she expected to be paid. He would tell her what he could offer, and she would tell him if it was acceptable, and that would be the end of it. But before he got to that, one of his ranch hands walked past the open door, glanced inside, and stopped. His name was Dale Pruitt. He was 24 years old, had been working cattle since he was 16 and had the particular confidence of a young man who had never in his life been seriously wrong about anything that mattered enough to correct him. "That her," Dale said. "Nathaniel said Eleanor Whitaker. She's going to run the smokehouse." Dale looked at Eleanor with the expression men like Dale reserved for things that surprised them in ways they considered beneath their dignity. Eleanor did not turn around. She was already studying the hanging rods again, her back to both of them. "Yes," Nathaniel said in a tone that was meant to end the conversation. Dale didn't take the tone. "I'm just saying," he said, dropping his voice in the way that was somehow worse than saying it at full volume. "I figured you'd hire someone who you know, someone who looked like they could handle the work." There was a pause. Eleanor turned around. She looked at Dale Pruitt with the kind of calm, level gaze that some people spend their whole lives trying to manufacture and never quite manage, because it doesn't come from practice. It comes from years of deciding that other people's small cruelties simply do not have the power to reach the part of you that matters. "I can handle the work," she said. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "The question is whether you can handle being wrong about that. Because by Thursday of next week, there will be a full side of cured pork hanging in this building that was done right properly, brined, properly smoked, no shortcuts, no spoilage. And at that point, you're going to have a choice. You can keep thinking what you're thinking right now, which is your right as a free man. Or you can decide that what a person can do is more interesting than what a person looks like." She tilted her head slightly. "Either way, the pork will still be there." Dale opened his mouth, closed it, walked away. Nathaniel watched him go. Then he looked back at Eleanor, who had already turned back to the hanging rods and was testing one with her full body weight methodically like none of it had happened. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed without turning around. "Send someone with the salt and the hickory by end of day today. I'll have the firebox running by tomorrow morning." She did not ask if he believed her. That was the day Nathaniel Carter realized that Eleanor Whitaker did not operate on belief. She operated on facts, and she intended to produce them. He sent the salt and the hickory. She had the firebox running by the next morning. The salt arrived in two 50-pound sacks, which Dale Pruitt dropped outside the smokehouse door with a particular kind of carelessness that was its own form of commentary. Eleanor carried them both inside herself, one at a time, without asking for help. She set them against the east wall, checked their quality with her fingers, rubbing a small amount between her palms, feeling the grain, holding it near her nose, and nodded once to herself. The hickory came in a split cord, stacked on a flatbed that one of the other hands, a quieter man named Tobias, helped her unload without being asked. Tobias didn't say much. He handed pieces down from the flatbed, and she stacked them against the south wall of the smokehouse in a specific pattern. Not the way people usually stacked wood, but with gaps between the pieces that allowed air to move through, which she explained to Tobias when he looked at it funny. "It needs to stay dry," she said. "Wet wood makes bitter smoke. Bitter smoke gets into the fat and you lose the whole batch." Tobias nodded, like that made perfect sense. Because it did. "You done this a lot?" he asked. "All my life," she said. That was all either of them said about it. The first fire she built in the repaired firebox she had managed the repairs herself using a piece of scrap iron she found behind the barn, and a technique for setting it without a proper forge that she had learned from her father. Under circumstances, she didn't go into burned low and even and exactly the way she wanted it to burn. She stood over it for 20 minutes, feeding small pieces of hickory in a specific sequence, watching the way the smoke rose and curled and moved toward the damaged vent. She had brought a piece of cloth with her, a square of dark cotton, and she held it near the vent at different heights until she found the position where the airflow was at its weakest. Then she went to her bag, which she had set against the inside wall, and took out a small tool that nobody on the ranch would have recognized, a thin curved piece of metal with a notch filed into one end, which she used to adjust the vent from the inside without opening it fully. Nobody watched her do this because nobody thought to come look. That would change. By the end of the first day, the smoke was running clean and controlled through the repaired firebox, up through the chamber, and out through the adjusted vent in a thin, steady column that you could see from the main house if you looked in the right direction. Nathaniel looked. He didn't say anything about it to anyone. He just looked and then went back to what he was doing. The pork came from the hogs they'd slaughtered 2 days before Eleanor arrived, 4 of them, which should have been enough to produce a substantial store of cured meat if the process went right. The carcasses had been hanging in the cold since the slaughter, which was correct, and Eleanor inspected each one before she broke them down, running her hands along the muscle groups with the same focused attention she gave everything. "These are good," she told Nathaniel when he stopped by to check. Whoever managed the slaughter knew what they were doing. The bleeding was clean. "That was Tobias," he said. "Tell him," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Tell him what?" "That he did it right." She didn't look up from what she was doing. People who do things right should be told. It doesn't happen enough. He didn't respond immediately. He watched her work for another moment, the efficient, unhurried movement of her hands, the way she didn't waste a single motion, and then he went and found Tobias and told him. Tobias looked surprised, then pleased. Then he went back to work with slightly better posture, which Nathaniel noticed and thought about for longer than he expected to. The first 3 days in the smokehouse were quiet ones from the perspective of everyone else at Black River. Eleanor arrived before dawn and worked until well past dark. She ate whatever the cook set aside for her, a plate she collected from the kitchen and carried back to eat near the fire, and she slept in the small room at the back of the smokehouse that had been Gus's room, which nobody had entered since Gus died. She had asked permission to use it. Nathaniel had said yes, and then felt strange that she'd felt she needed to ask. On the morning of the second day, Dale Pruitt made another pass. He had apparently been waiting for evidence that he was right, that she couldn't handle it, that the meat was already ruined, that something had gone wrong that he could point to. He stopped outside the smokehouse door and called in. "How's it going in there?" "Fine," Eleanor said. "Fire looks different than it used to look when Gus ran it." "Gus used green wood," she said, still not looking up. "Green wood makes heavy smoke. Heavy smoke deposits creosote. Creosote ruins the flavor and can make people sick if the concentration is high enough." A pause. "I'm not using green wood." Dale stood there for another moment. "Just checking," he said. "I know," she said. "You're welcome to come back Thursday." He did not come back Thursday. But the other hands did, all 3 of them, including Tobias and a red-faced older man named Clement, who had worked cattle his whole life and claimed to have no opinions about anything that wasn't beef. They stood outside the smokehouse door on Thursday afternoon and waited while Eleanor went to the back of the chamber and returned carrying a section of pork belly that she laid across the work table near the door. The smell that came with it was not the heavy, acrid smell of smoke applied without knowledge. It was something else, layered and clean, the hickory underneath, and something sweeter above it, the fat, having taken the smoke in the way that correctly cured meat, did slow and deep without bitterness. Clement leaned over the table and looked at it. He touched the surface with one finger. He looked at Eleanor. "That's proper," he said. It was not a large compliment from a man like Clement. Eleanor accepted it with a nod. "There's more behind it," she said. "That's the first batch. The rest will be ready by end of next week, assuming the temperature holds." Tobias was grinning. "So Dale was wrong." "Dale has opinions," Eleanor said mildly. "Most people do. The meat doesn't care about opinions." Clement actually laughed at that. It was a short sound, like something that surprised him on the way out, but it was real. Nathaniel was not there for that moment. He heard about it later from Tobias, who told the story with the particular pleasure of someone who had watched the right person be proven right. Nathaniel listened to the whole thing without changing his expression. Then he put on his coat and walked out to the smokehouse. Eleanor was inside tending the fire. She looked up when he came in. "Clement said it was proper," Nathaniel said. "He did," she agreed. "Clement hasn't used that word about anything since we got the new well dug 2 years ago." "It's a good word," she said. "It means what it says." Nathaniel stood near the doorway, He wasn't used to not knowing what to say, but he stood there for a moment in that unusual condition. The fire was burning low and steady the way it always burned when she was running it, and the chamber was warm in a way the smokehouse had never been warm in his memory. Not just hot near the fire, but evenly warm all the way to the far wall, like the heat was being managed rather than just produced. "You fixed the vents," he said. "I adjusted them. They're not fixed would require new materials, but I got them close enough that the draw is even." "I could get new materials." She looked at him. "If you could, that would help. But it's not urgent right now. I've got the temperature where I need it." He nodded. There was another pause. "How many batches before we've got what we need for winter?" he asked. "2 more after this one," she said. "Maybe 2.5 depending on what you've got left in the cold store. I'd like to look at what's there and tell you exactly. I'll take you out there tomorrow morning." "All right." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Eleanor," she said. He paused at that. People out here didn't often volunteer their first name in a professional arrangement. It wasn't unfriendly the way she said it. It was direct, like she was handing him information she considered relevant. "Eleanor," he said. "I didn't ask you enough questions when I hired you. I should have." She tilted her head slightly. "You asked the right number of questions for the situation. You were short on time." "That's not an excuse." She looked at him with the same level expression she'd given Dale Pruitt on the first morning, except that this one was different. There was something in it that wasn't judgment, wasn't defensiveness, but something quieter than either of those things. "No," she said. "It's not. But it's also done. The question is, what happens from here?" He held that for a moment. "What happens from here?" he said almost to himself. "The next batch is ready Friday," she said, turning back to the fire. "If the weather holds." He left her to it. But that night, sitting in the house with the cold pressing against the windows and the fire doing its job in the hearth, he found himself thinking about the phrase she'd used. Not the job she was doing, though he was thinking about that too. Thinking about it with the particular low relief of a man who has been bracing for catastrophe and found one doorway out, but the specific, plain, practical weight of what she'd said. The question is, what happens from here? It was such a simple sentence. He could not have explained why it stayed with him the way it did. On the 5th day, Eleanor asked him a question that caught him sideways. She asked him what his wife had been like. He was standing near the door, not quite inside, and not quite out in the way he'd developed of checking on the smokehouse without committing to staying. He had not expected the question. He had not talked about Margaret, not to anyone, not since the funeral, not in a way that felt like talking rather than reporting. "She was practical," he said finally. "She didn't waste time on things she couldn't change." Eleanor nodded slowly, like she was filing that away somewhere useful. "Did she like it here, the ranch?" He thought about that. "She liked what it could be," he said. "She was patient with what it was." "That's a hard thing to be," Eleanor said. "Patient with what something is while loving what it could be." He looked at her. "Did your father teach you that too? Or is that your own?" She smiled, a real one, not the careful, measured expression she usually kept. "That one's mine. I've had a lot of practice at it." He thought about asking what she meant. He didn't because he thought he already understood. "How long has it been?" she asked. "Since she passed." 4 years, he said. Eleanor nodded and turned back to the fire. 4 years is long enough to know you're still carrying it, she said, and not quite long enough to know how to put it down. He stood there for a moment. "That's about right," he said. She didn't make it a big thing the way some people would have, the way people who didn't know him tried to showing their sympathy, the way someone shows a wound with urgency and exposure. She just nodded, adjusted the draft on the firebox, and moved on. He was grateful for that. He had not expected to be grateful for something so small, but there it was. The second week passed faster than the first. The rhythm of the smokehouse had established itself as its own thing, separate from the rhythm of the rest of the ranch, and yet somehow it had begun to pull everything else into alignment with it. The hands ate better, Not because the food itself had changed dramatically, but because there was something in knowing that the smokehouse was working, that the fire hadn't gone out, that the person tending it knew exactly what she was doing. The uncertainty that had been sitting at the center of Black River for 3 years, the particular grinding dread of a ranch that knew it was struggling without knowing how to stop, had shifted by some small but significant degree. Dale Pruitt, for his part, had stopped making comments. He hadn't apologized. He wasn't the type, but he'd stopped standing outside the smokehouse with his opinions, and on Thursday of the second week, Nathaniel came around the east corner of the building and found Dale stacking wood near the door in a specific pattern, the same way Eleanor stacked it with the gaps between pieces for air circulation. Nathaniel did not say anything about it. Dale did not look up. The wood was stacked correctly. Eleanor, when she came out and saw it, paused for a moment. Then she said, "The pieces on the top layer should be turned bark side down," and went back inside. Dale stood there for a moment. Then he reorganized the top layer. Nobody made anything of it. But Nathaniel watched and felt something complicated and hard to name, something that might have been hope if he'd been less afraid of that particular word. It was on a Friday, the end of the second week, that Nathaniel Carter walked into the smokehouse at a time he didn't usually come by, midday, when Eleanor would normally have been in the quietest phase of the fire management, keeping it steady rather than adjusting it, and found her sitting on the low stool near the firebox, not working, just sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the fire. He almost backed out, but she looked up before he could. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," she said. She didn't move from the stool, but she gestured with one hand toward a wooden crate on the opposite side of the firebox, which was the closest thing to an invitation to sit that she was in a position to offer. He sat on the crate. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The fire did what it always did, low, steady, exactly where it needed to be. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked. He didn't know exactly what he was asking. The question came out before he'd shaped it properly. She seemed to understand it anyway. "The fire," she said. "No, the fire is the honest part." She paused. "People are harder." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't have an answer, but the quiet of someone who is deciding how much of the answer to give. "My whole life," she said at last, "people have looked at me and decided what I'm capable of before I've opened my mouth, before I've touched anything or done anything or offered a single word about myself. They see the way I look, and they've already finished the story." She said it simply, without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness would have been, because it meant the thing she was describing was so settled in her experience that even anger about it had worn smooth. "I've learned to let the work speak, because I can't change what people see when they look at me. But I can change what they have to acknowledge when they look at what I've done." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Dale stacked the wood your way today," he said. She almost smiled. "I saw." He didn't say anything about it. He didn't have to. Nathaniel looked at his hands. He was a man who spent most of his time looking outward at the land, at the cattle, at the horizon, and looking at his own hands felt like a different kind of reckoning. "I almost didn't hire you," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see it. I'm not proud of that." "You hired me," she said. "That's the part that matters." He wanted to tell her that the hiring had come from desperation, more than fairness. That he would not have made the same choice if there had been other options. That the version of Nathaniel Carter who hired Eleanor Whitaker was not as principled as the one who was sitting here now on this crate beside this fire having this conversation. He didn't say any of that. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because she seemed to already know it, and she had decided for her own reasons that it wasn't the thing she needed him to say. "The second batch is done," she said, turning back to the fire. "Better than the first. If you want to take a look at the inventory tonight, I can tell you exactly where we stand." "I'll come by after supper," he said. He stood from the crate. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "Thank you." He said it the way he said the important things, short and with his full attention behind it. For staying. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for the key," she said. He left the smokehouse. The trouble started on a Saturday. It was market day in town, and Nathaniel had driven in to pick up a few supplies. He couldn't wait on flour coffee and a specific gauge of wire he needed for a fence repair before the ground froze solid. He tied up outside the feed store and went in, handled his business, and was loading the wagon when he heard his name spoken behind him by a voice he recognized. Thomas Aldridge. He ran the largest merchant operation in that part of Montana. Dry goods, hardware, grain, a little of everything, and he had made an art form over the years of packaging contempt inside the language of concern. "Carter," Aldridge said, "I hear you brought in some woman to run your smokehouse." Nathaniel kept loading the wagon. "Word travels," he said. "It does," Aldridge said. He came around to the side of the wagon where Nathaniel was working. Not to help Aldridge never helped with anything that didn't benefit Aldridge, but to have the conversation on his terms, which meant face-to-face. "I'm just saying, a man in your position can't afford to look like he's making decisions out of desperation. People see that." "People see what they want to see," Nathaniel said. "The woman you hired," Aldridge pressed with the particular enjoyment of a man who is about to say something he's been saving up. "She's well. I'll just say she's not what most folks around here would expect to see running an operation, the size of her alone." Nathaniel set down the bag of flour he was holding. He turned and looked at Aldridge directly the way he looked at things when he was done being casual about them. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, "the woman you're describing walked into a smokehouse that hadn't run in 3 years and had a fire burning in 24 hours. She fixed a firebox with scrap iron and produced properly cured pork inside of a week. She hasn't asked me for more than she needs. She hasn't complained about a single thing, and she knows more about meat preservation than anyone I've ever hired." He picked the flour back up and turned toward the wagon. "So whatever you were going to say after the size of her, I'd save it. Because it doesn't have anything to do with the job she's doing." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "I'm only saying," he started. "I know what you're saying," Nathaniel said. "And I'm telling you what's actually happening at my ranch. Those are 2 different conversations." He finished loading the wagon and drove back to Black River. He did not tell Eleanor what Aldridge had said, but he thought about it on the drive back, the way he sometimes thought about things that bothered him more than they should, with a kind of grinding low-level anger that had nowhere useful to go. He thought about Eleanor carrying those 50-pound salt sacks one at a time without asking for help. He thought about her fixing the firebox with a piece of scrap iron she'd found on her own, without being asked, without making a show of it. He thought about the way Dale had reorganized the wood stack and not said a word about it. He thought about the phrase she'd used. "The question is, what happens from here?" By the time he pulled up to the barn, he had made a decision that he didn't announce to anyone, because it wasn't the kind of decision that needed announcing. It was the kind that simply became true, like the first frost or the moment a fire catches, and you know it's going to hold. Eleanor Whitaker was not a temporary hire. He just didn't know yet how to tell her that. Outside, the sky was doing the thing it did in Montana in late October, going gray and heavy at the edges, the kind of sky that meant weather. He stood for a moment and looked at it. Then he looked at the thin line of smoke rising from the smokehouse vent, clean and steady, exactly as it should be. The ranch was not saved yet. There was more work to do, more batches to cure, more cold to survive, more of the long grinding labor of keeping a piece of land alive through a winter that didn't care about anyone's plans or debts or stubborn pride. But for the first time in 3 years, Nathaniel Carter looked at his own property and felt something other than the slow, familiar pressure of everything that was going wrong. The smokehouse fire was burning. The woman who had insisted on tending it knew exactly what she was doing. And somewhere in the distance, the first real cold of the season was beginning its long, inevitable approach toward a ranch that was, for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, beginning to look like it might be ready. The cold came early that year, not the gentle, creeping cold that usually announced itself in stages. A hard frost one morning, a dusting of snow the next, the kind of cold that gave a man time to prepare. This was the other kind. The kind that showed up overnight without warning, dropping the temperature 30 degrees between sunset and dawn, and leaving everything, the water troughs, the mud ruts in the yard, the leather of a saddle left outside by mistake, locked solid by morning. Nathaniel discovered it when he stepped off the porch at 5 in the morning, and his boot cracked through a thin sheet of ice that had formed in the low spot near the steps. He stood still for a moment and looked at the sky. It was the wrong color for October, too pale, too flat, the kind of sky that meant the cold wasn't finished with what it had started. He went directly to the smokehouse. Eleanor was already awake. She was always already awake. He had stopped being surprised by this in the second week, but it still struck him every time, the way the smokehouse was always lit, always warm, always running exactly the way it should be, because the person responsible for it had never not once let it slip. He pushed open the door and found her crouched near the firebox, feeding Hickory in the particular sequence she used when the outside temperature dropped smaller pieces more frequently to keep the internal heat steady without spiking it. She didn't look up. "I know," she said. "How bad is it in here?" Temperature dropped 6 degrees overnight. She added another piece of wood. "I caught it at 3. It's back where it needs to be." He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "The last batch," he said, "is fine." She stood and turned to face him. Her eyes were clear despite the hour, despite whatever kind of sleep she'd managed on that narrow cot in the back room. "The second batch is finished and cured correctly. The third batch went in yesterday and it's holding. The only risk was the temperature drop tonight and I managed it." Nathaniel nodded. He looked at the fire, then at the rows of cured meat hanging in the darkness behind her, and something that had been coiled tight in his chest for weeks, loosened by 1 degree. "You should have woken me," he said. "You couldn't have done anything I wasn't already doing," she said simply. "There was no reason to wake you." He wanted to argue with that. He didn't because she was right. What he said instead was, "Sit down for a minute. I'll get coffee." She looked at him with a slight expression of surprise, not a large one. Not the kind that made a show of itself, but the kind that meant the offer had landed somewhere she hadn't expected. "All right," she said. He went to the main house, got 2 cups of coffee from the pot the cook always left on the back of the stove, and carried them back to the smokehouse. When he returned, Eleanor was sitting on the stool near the firebox, with her hands in her lap, not doing anything, just resting, which he realized was something he had never seen her do before. In 2 weeks, he had never once seen Eleanor Whitaker simply rest. He handed her a cup and sat on the crate. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The fire worked steadily beside them, and outside the cold pressed against the walls, and the ranch was quiet, in the particular way it was quiet at 5 in the morning. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended like the whole world was holding its breath before the day began. "How much longer?" he asked. "On the third batch, 4 more days if the temperature holds, 3 if we get a break in the weather." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "After that we'll have enough. Not a surplus, but enough. Enough to carry 12 people through to March. Closer to April," she said. "If you're careful with it." He nodded. April. That was further than he had let himself think when October began. In October, March had felt like an impossible distance. "What happens after April?" she asked. He looked at her. It was a strange question. Not strange because it was inappropriate. Nothing Eleanor said was inappropriate. She had a quality of directness that somehow never felt like intrusion. But strange because it was the question he had been most afraid to look at directly. What happened after April? What happened when winter was over and the smokehouse was empty, and the work that had held everything together was finished? "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected, and maybe the one she'd been hoping for, not a plan, but honesty about the absence of one. "You have good land," she said. "The grass in the east pasture alone could run twice the cattle you have now if you had the capital to stock it." "I don't have the capital." "Not yet," she said. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant by that. The door banged open. It was Dale Pruitt, and he was breathing fast, which was unusual enough that both Nathaniel and Eleanor were on their feet before he'd gotten the door closed behind him. "There's a man at the gate," Dale said, "riding a gray. He's got a letter with a territorial seal on it." Nathaniel set down his coffee. "What kind of letter?" "The kind that comes with a man wearing a badge," Dale said. "Deputy Marshal says he needs to speak with you directly." The three of them looked at each other. Outside, the cold morning was no longer suspended. Something had broken the stillness, and not gently. Nathaniel put on his coat. The deputy marshal's name was Hector Greer, and he was a compact, weathered man in his 40s who had the look of someone who had delivered bad news enough times that he'd stopped wasting words on the approach. He was standing at the gate when Nathaniel arrived, holding his horse's reins and a sealed envelope that he handed over without preamble. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry to come at this hour." Nathaniel took the envelope. He broke the seal and read it standing up the same way he'd read the letter from Billings, because the posture didn't help with bad news, but it was habit by now. The letter was from the Territorial Land Office. It said that a formal complaint had been filed challenging the title to Black River Ranch on the grounds that the original deed, the one Nathaniel's father had registered in 1861, contained a material error in the boundary description that rendered 40% of the ranch's most productive land legally unclaimed. The complainant was Thomas Aldridge. Nathaniel read it twice. Then he folded it and looked at Deputy Marshal Greer. "Aldridge filed this last week," Greer said. He didn't look happy about it. Some men in his position would have been there were deputy marshals who enjoyed the authority of delivering documents like this one, who took something from the discomfort of the recipient. Greer was not one of those men. "The Territorial Court has set a hearing for the 14th of next month. You'll need documentation. Original deed survey records anything that establishes the boundary as your father registered it." "The original deed is in a strong box in the house," Nathaniel said. "Then I'd look at it very carefully," Greer said, "and I'd get a lawyer before the 14th. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode back toward town. Nathaniel stood at the gate for a moment after he'd gone, the cold going right through his coat. He was looking at the folded letter in his hand. Thomas Aldridge. The man who had stood beside his wagon 2 weeks ago and started a sentence with, "the size of her alone." Who had packaged his contempt in the language of concern and then gone straight home and filed a legal challenge against a ranch already on the edge of collapse. Dale had followed him out to the gate. He stood a few feet back, not saying anything. "Go get Clement and Tobias," Nathaniel said. "I want everyone at the table in 20 minutes. He went to the house, unlocked the strongbox, and pulled out the original deed. He read it slowly. His father's name was on it, the ranch's founding date, and a description of the boundaries that he read 3 times before the problem became clear. The survey description used a creek as a reference point. The creek had moved. He brought the deed to the smokehouse that afternoon. Not for any formal reason, he could have looked at it alone. But Eleanor had a quality of seeing things clearly without the emotional weight he was carrying, and he needed that more than he needed privacy. She read it twice. Then she read the boundary description a 3rd time, and he watched her pause. "The creek," she said. "I know." She looked up. "When did it shift?" "About 15 years ago, after a heavy spring flood, 40-50 yards east, maybe more in the low section near the pasture." Eleanor set the deed down carefully. "Then Aldridge isn't wrong about the technical problem," she said. "Not an accusation, a fact. The deed as written places the boundary at the creek's current location, which puts the eastern pasture as it's currently used outside the legal description." She looked at him steadily. "He's been waiting for this. He's known about it for a while. He waited for the right moment, a moment when you were weak enough that a legal challenge would be enough to finish you." The room was very quiet. "What do I do?" Nathaniel said. "Is there anyone who was present when your father registered the deed?" she asked. "Anyone who can speak to where the boundary was always understood to be Art Pickford," he said slowly. "He ranched the property north of us from 1858 to 1879. His fence line butted up against our eastern boundary. He was there." "Then you go find Art Pickford," she said. something in her expression not quite approval, but close. "Yes," he said. "I do." He went back to the house and called his hands to the table. He told them straight the way he always did. No cushioning, no preamble. What the letter said. What it meant. The eastern pasture gone if Aldridge won. The herd cut further. The already thin margins thinner. Dale said, "That son of a—" "Dale," Nathaniel said. Dale stopped. Tobias said carefully, "Is there anything that can prove the boundary was always where it's been understood to be?" "Survey records," Nathaniel said. "The original surveyor's notes if they still exist. Territorial Records Office in Billings or the county seat." 3 days' ride, Clement said. "Then someone better leave soon," Nathaniel said. A pause around the table. "I'll go," Tobias said. Nathaniel looked at him. Tobias was his most reliable man, best with horses, most likely to make the round trip without incident. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Tell me what to look for." They spent the next hour going through it, what records Tobias needed, what arguments to make. Roy wrote it down because Roy had the best handwriting. Clement offered to handle Tobias's regular work while he was gone. Dale didn't offer anything, but he didn't argue either. By 8 in the morning, Tobias was saddled and riding. The cold that morning had done something beyond the practical damage. It had changed the mood of the place. By the time the sun was fully up, Roy had snapped at Dale over a tool left in the wrong place. Clement had gone silent in the way that meant he was working through something he considered not worth discussing. And Dale himself was walking the yard with the tight jaw of a man who needed somewhere to put his frustration. Nathaniel noticed. And he went back to the smokehouse because that was where he went when he needed to think clearly. Eleanor was checking the hanging rods when he came in, moving from piece to piece, pressing gently with 2 fingers, reading the curing progress the way she read everything, methodically, without hurry. "Dale's in a mood," he said. "Dale is scared," she said without looking up. "Scared men look angry. It's easier." He considered that. "And Clement? Worried and trying not to show it because he thinks it would be disrespectful." She moved to the next piece. "Roy is fine. Young enough that worry still makes him want to do something, which is actually the most useful response of the 3. Nathaniel leaned against the door frame. "How do you know all this? You've barely spoken to any of them this week." "I listen," she said. "You learn a lot about people from what they do when they think no one's paying attention." A pause. Dale dropped his coffee cup this morning and swore at it for 30 seconds. Clement sharpened a tool that didn't need sharpening. Roy reorganized the feed stacks. Same fear, 3 different ways of carrying it. Nathaniel watched her move down the row. "What do I do?" he asked. She glanced at him, a brief look that held something in it. Recognition that the question was real. That he was trusting her with something that mattered. "Talk to them," she said. "Not about the ranch's finances. Not about what might happen. Just be present. Let them see you're not panicking." "I'm not panicking." "Then let them see that." He went and found his men and spent 2 hours working alongside them, one to the next, not talking about the credit line, or the winter, or any of the things they were all afraid of. Just working. Just being there, steady the way a man who ran a place was supposed to be. By afternoon, the mood had shifted. Not resolved, but shifted. He left for Art Pickford's the next morning, taking Roy with him. They rode hard for 2 days through country that got flatter and colder. Moving east until they reached the county seat in the early evening of the second day, and found Art Pickford on his porch, sitting in a coat too thin for the weather. Watching the road with the deliberate patience of a man who had already seen most of what the world had to offer. Art Pickford was 73 years old and sharp as wire. When Nathaniel explained the situation, the deed, the creek shift, the boundary dispute, Aldridge's claim, the old man listened without moving. Then he said, "I always wondered when someone would try that." Nathaniel looked at him. "You knew about the creek." "I knew about Aldridge," Art said. "Man's been watching that eastern pasture for 15 years, waiting for something he could use." He shook his head slowly. "Your father registered that boundary exactly where the surveyor put it, and they both knew the creek moved. The ridge and the cottonwoods, those were the real fixed markers. The creek was a convenience. "Would you testify to that?" Nathaniel asked. Art Pickford was quiet for a long moment. "Your father stood at my fence line in the winter of 1862. He said, when my cattle were dying and I had nothing coming, and he split his stores with me. He didn't have to." A pause. "Yes, I'll testify." Nathaniel let out a slow breath. "There's more," Art said. He stood from his chair with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had earned their complaints, went inside and came back with a leather case old and worn, which he set on the porch railing between them. "Letters, between my father and yours, 1860 to 1863. The creek is mentioned in two of them as a moving reference, not a fixed one. Your father and my father agreed explicitly that the boundary was to be fixed by the ridge and the cottonwoods, not the creek." He opened the case and handed over a stack of papers. "Take them." Nathaniel held the papers with the care of a man handling something that might be the difference between keeping and losing everything. "Mr. Pickford," he started. "Don't thank me," the old man said. "Bring the ranch through, that's all." They rode back hard. 2 days in the saddle, the cold worsening, as they moved west, a sky that kept threatening snow without delivering it, as if saving the worst for later. Roy didn't complain once, which Nathaniel filed away. They arrived back at Black River on the evening of the 4th day. The first thing Nathaniel noticed was the smoke. Thin, clean, steady, rising from the smokehouse vent, exactly the way it always rose. Nothing had changed. The fire had not gone out. The batches that were curing when he left were still curing, still correctly managed, still doing exactly what they were supposed to do. He stood outside the barn and looked at that line of smoke. Roy said, "She kept it going." "She always keeps it going," Nathaniel said. He went to the smokehouse. Eleanor was inside adjusting the fire at the end of the day, with the particular attention she gave it at this hour, not as vigilant as the morning checks, but never careless. She never let the work slip into carelessness. She looked up when he came in. "You got there and back," she said. "We did." He held up the leather case with Art Pickford's letters. "And we brought something." She looked at the case, then at his face reading it. "Good news," she said. "Good news," he confirmed. He sat on his crate and told her about Art Pickford. The letters, what the old man had said and what he'd agreed to. Eleanor listened with her hands around a coffee cup, the way she sometimes sat in the evenings when the work had settled into its overnight rhythm, and she allowed herself an hour of something that wasn't labor. When he finished, she said, "The ridge and the cottonwoods, still standing. Both of them." She nodded slowly. "Then Aldridge has no case, not against letters in your father's own hand, not with a witness who was there. Not if the court looks at it honestly." "You think there's a risk it won't?" "Aldridge has money," he said. "Money buys influence. I've seen it before." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did it cost you getting there and back?" Honest answer. He considered it. Decided honesty was the only thing that made sense with her. 3 weeks of margin, he said. "The supplies I'd planned to restock, I'll have to wait until spring. And if the hearing goes badly, I'll need to borrow, which means interest, which means I'll need the eastern pasture producing at full capacity next summer just to service the debt." She looked at the fire for a moment. "Then we make sure the hearing doesn't go badly," she said. He looked at her. "We." She met his eyes. "You have the letters. You have Art Pickford. You have survey records coming from Tobias." A pause, and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but opening. "And you have me if you want me there. I can read a document and I can speak clearly, and I have spent my entire life learning to make people who have already decided something about me look at something else instead." He held that for a moment. "The hearing is in 2 weeks," he said. "Then we have 2 weeks," she said. Tobias arrived 2 days later cold and carrying a saddlebag full of documents that he laid on the kitchen table with the care of a man who understood what he was carrying. The survey records were there, all of them. What the original surveyor's notes showed in handwriting careful and precise and dated 1861 was exactly what Art Pickford had described. The eastern boundary described in reference to 3 markers. And at the bottom of the second page in the same careful hand, a note that made Nathaniel go very still. Creek noted as subject to seasonal movement. Boundary defined by ridge and cottonwood markers in the event of creek relocation. Dale read it over his shoulder. "Well," Dale said. He was quiet for a moment. "Aldridge is going to be real unhappy." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Good," Dale said. It was the first time in 2 weeks that Nathaniel had heard Dale say something he completely agreed with. He sent the documentation to the territorial court the following morning, copies of the surveyor's notes, the letters from Art Pickford's case, and Art's formal notarized statement. Then he waited. And while he waited, Eleanor finished the 3rd batch. She came out of the smokehouse on a Tuesday morning 3 days before the hearing, and stood in the yard with the cold air around her and the snow crunching under her boots, and she looked at Nathaniel, who was crossing from the barn, and stopped when he saw her expression. "It's done," she said. He stopped walking. "All of it, all of it." She looked back at the smokehouse. "Enough pork to carry this ranch through to the first week of April. Properly cured. No shortcuts. Nothing that's going to spoil on you." She turned back to face him. "Black River Ranch is going to make it through the winter, Nathaniel." He stood in the snow and looked at her. He had held himself together through a lot. The letter from Billings. The deputy marshal at the gate. The ride to Art Pickford and back. The 2 days waiting for Tobias. He had held himself together the way he held himself through most things, by keeping his jaw set and his eyes forward, and not looking directly at what he was afraid of. He looked directly at Eleanor Whitaker, standing in the snow in front of the smokehouse she had rebuilt and run and kept burning without asking for more than she needed, and something in the set of his jaw let go. "Thank you," he said. It came out lower than he intended. She looked at him steadily. "You gave me the chance. You made something of it. That's what people do," she said, "when someone finally gives them the chance." The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of hickory smoke from the vent above. He took 1 step toward her. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up at him. "After the hearing," he said, "I want to talk to you about something." She studied his face with the same full attention she gave everything thorough, unhurried, missing nothing. "All right," she said. "After the hearing," he said again. "I'll be here," she said. And then, with the smallest shift in her expression, not quite a smile but close. "I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel." He nodded. He went back to the barn. And the smokehouse fire kept burning. The morning of the hearing, Nathaniel Carter did not sleep. He had not expected to sleep. He had gone to bed at a reasonable hour, the way a practical man does when he knows the next day requires everything he has. And he had lain there in the dark, listening to the wind work against the walls of the house, and the distant, steady sound of the smokehouse fire, which he could not actually hear from this distance, but which he had listened for anyway. The way you listen for a heartbeat you've gotten used to. At 4 in the morning, he got up, put on his clothes, and went to the smokehouse. Eleanor was awake. Of course she was awake. She was sitting on her stool with a cup of coffee already made, and when he came through the door, she looked up at him with the expression of someone who had been expecting him for about an hour. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat on the crate. She handed him the second cup she had made too, which meant she had known he was coming, which was the kind of thing she did without comment and without making anything of it, the way she did most things. He wrapped his hands around it. "Tell me what you're most afraid of," she said. He looked at her. In 3 weeks, she had never asked him a question quite like that one, that direct, that bare. It was the kind of question most people danced around with softer language with, "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Or, "Do you think it'll go all right?" All the versions of the real question that let both parties maintain a comfortable distance from the actual answer. Eleanor did not do comfortable distance. "That it doesn't matter what evidence we bring," he said. that Aldridge has already done the work that matters, that he's spoken to the right people, paid the right people, and we walk in there with Art Pickford and the letters and the surveyor's notes, and it still isn't enough. That the law does what the law sometimes does, which is give a formal reason for an outcome that was decided before anyone sat down. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's a real fear," she said. "Yes. And what do you do if it happens?" He looked at the fire. "Fight it. Appeal to the territorial court. Take it further if I have to." "That costs money." "I know." "Money you don't have." "Money I'll find," he said. "If I have to sell cattle to fund a legal fight, I sell cattle. This ranch has been in my family since 1861. My father built it with nothing. I am not handing it to Thomas Aldridge because he has more lawyers than I do." The silence that followed was the kind that meant something. Eleanor said, "Good." Just that. One word quietly, like a verdict. He looked at her. "Good. That's the man who needs to walk into that courtroom today," she said. "Not the one who couldn't sleep, this one." He held her gaze for a moment. "You're coming," he said. "I told you I would." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She stood from the stool and set her cup on the shelf with the efficient finality of someone who has made their decision and is done discussing it. "Dale and Clement can manage the smokehouse for one day. The fire is stable. The curing is done. There is nothing I am needed for here more than I am needed in that room." She looked at him steadily. "You need someone beside you who isn't afraid of Thomas Aldridge." "I'm not afraid of Thomas Aldridge." Nathaniel Carter almost smiled. He did not smile often, but he almost did. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." They left for town at 6 in the morning, Nathaniel and Eleanor in the wagon, Roy and Tobias riding alongside Art Pickford, waiting for them at the edge of town where they'd arranged to meet. The old man was already there when they arrived, sitting on his horse with the patience of someone who understood that punctuality was a form of respect. He tipped his hat to Eleanor when she stepped down from the wagon. "Ma'am," he said, "Art Pickford." "Eleanor Whitaker," she said. "Thank you for making the trip." "Wouldn't miss it," Art said, with the particular dry quality of a man who meant it. The territorial courthouse was full that morning, more full than Nathaniel had expected. News traveled in a territory this size, and a land dispute involving Black River Ranch and Thomas Aldridge had apparently been worth traveling for. Aldridge was already inside when they entered. He was seated at the respondents' table with two lawyers from Billings, both in suits that announced they had been brought in specifically for this, and he had the comfortable, settled look of a man who has arranged his pieces carefully and is now simply waiting for the game to proceed. He looked up when Nathaniel came in. His eyes moved immediately to Eleanor. Something happened in his expression. A flicker of surprise quickly suppressed, replaced by the deliberate blankness of a man who does not want to show that anything has surprised him. Nathaniel noticed. Eleanor noticed and said nothing and sat down. The judge was a man named Harlan Briggs, 60 years old, with the kind of face that had heard a great many arguments and been persuaded by approximately half of them. He called the hearing to order with the businesslike efficiency of a man who had a full docket and no patience for theater. Aldridge's lawyers went first. They were good. Nathaniel had expected them to be good, and they were polished, organized, precise. They laid out the claim in careful technical language. The deed described a boundary using the creek as a fixed reference point. The creek had moved the land currently occupied by Black River Ranch as the eastern pasture, therefore extended beyond the legal boundary of the registered property. They had their own surveyor, a man who had mapped the creek's current location and produced a diagram showing the discrepancy. Clean work. Expensive work. The kind that cost what it cost because it was supposed to be overwhelming. Judge Briggs looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Carter, your response." Nathaniel stood. He was not a lawyer. He had not pretended to be one in preparing for today. What he had was the truth documented and witnessed, and he intended to present it as plainly as it deserved. He laid the surveyor's original notes on the judge's bench first. Then the letters from Art Pickford's case, the correspondence between their two fathers, describing the eastern boundary in explicit detail. Then Art Pickford's notarized statement. The boundary was established in 1861 using 3 reference markers, Nathaniel said. The creek was one. The ridge to the northeast was one. The line of cottonwoods to the southeast was one. The original surveyor noted in his own hand that the creek was subject to seasonal movement, and that the ridge and cottonwood markers were to define the boundary in the event of creek relocation. Those markers have not moved. The boundary has not moved. The only thing that has moved is the creek which the surveyor anticipated and documented at the time of the original survey. He paused. I also have a witness. Art Pickford ranched the property immediately north of Black River from 1858 to 1879. His fence line abutted our eastern boundary for 21 years. He has direct personal knowledge of where that boundary was always understood to be. Aldridge's lead lawyer was on his feet before Nathaniel had finished the last sentence. His name was Grover Hatch, and he was the kind of lawyer who had built a career on finding the weakest point in an opposing witness and pressing on it with calm, systematic efficiency. He had a long face and a longer memory, and he had done his preparation with the same expensive thoroughness that produced the survey diagram. He had found something about Art Pickford. Mr. Pickford, Hatch said, standing with the measured ease of someone comfortable in courtrooms. You testified to personal knowledge of the eastern boundary throughout your period of ownership, and you sold that property in 1879. That's right, Art said, which means your direct personal observation ended 45 years ago. My observation of where the stakes were driven and where the fence line ran, yes, Art said. My knowledge of what was agreed and why is in the letters. The letters your father wrote, Hatch said to Mr. Carter's father. 2 men who are both deceased and therefore unable to confirm what they meant. They wrote what they meant, Art said evenly. Men of that generation didn't write what they didn't mean. Hatch turned slightly, addressing both the judge and the room. Your Honor, I would submit that the personal recollection of a 73-year-old man about events that occurred when he was in his 20s on property he has not occupied in 45 years constitutes at best imprecise evidence. The letters are not imprecise, Nathaniel said. He had not meant to speak out of turn. It happened because Hatch's voice had taken on a particular quality, smooth, dismissive, the quality of a man who is very good at making truth sound like opinion, and something in Nathaniel's chest had responded to it the way a banked fire responds to a sudden draft. Judge Briggs looked at him. Mr. Carter, you'll have your opportunity. Yes, sir, Nathaniel said. He sat down. Under the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough to be deliberate, Eleanor set 2 fingers against the back of his wrist. He stilled. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at him. She simply held that contact for 3 seconds, the steady grounding pressure of someone saying without words, I know. And hold on. And you're all right. He breathed. He held on. And when Hatch finished his attack on Art Pickford's age, and the passage of time, and the imprecision of memory, and Judge Briggs gave Nathaniel the floor, he stood and said what he needed to say without heat and without bluster, and let the letters speak for themselves, and let Art Pickford's clear, steady testimony speak for itself. It was enough. It was more than enough. Art Pickford took 35 years of shared property knowledge and delivered it with the calm authority of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain except the correct outcome. He described the eastern fence line as it had existed for 21 years. He described the creek's movement after the spring flood of 1869, which he had witnessed. He described the conversation he'd had with Nathaniel's father the following summer, when both men had walked the boundary together and agreed that the ridge and the cottonwoods remained unchanged, and the boundary remained unchanged with them. Did you have any documentation of that conversation? The judge asked. We shook hands on it, Art said. But yes, I kept the letter your father wrote me 2 weeks later confirming it. It's in the stack Mr. Carter presented. Judge Briggs found the letter. Read it. Aldridge's lead lawyer tried twice more. once challenging the authenticity of the letters, once arguing that the surveyor's marginal note had no legal standing without formal ratification. Both times Judge Briggs listened with patient attention and ruled against him. The second ruling took 45 seconds. Nathaniel had been watching the judge's face throughout the way you watch the weather, looking for the shift the moment when the balance tipped. He saw it when Briggs put the letters down the second time. A settling in the older man's expression, a quality of decision arrived at. Aldridge knew too. Nathaniel saw it in the way the man's shoulders changed, the almost imperceptible drop of someone who has been holding himself upright through confidence and is beginning to hold himself upright through something else. Thomas Aldridge, at 62 years old, with 2 lawyers from Billings and a carefully prepared challenge and 15 years of patient waiting, was losing. And he knew it. Judge Briggs ruled at 11:45 in the morning. The boundary of Black River Ranch, as originally registered in 1861, remained valid. The eastern pasture belonged to Black River. The surveyor's original notation established beyond reasonable challenge that the ridge and cottonwood markers defined the eastern line, and the correspondence between the Carter and Pickford families confirmed that this understanding had been consistent and documented for more than 2 decades. The complaint filed by Thomas Aldridge was dismissed. Court costs were assessed against the complainant. The room was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then it wasn't. Nathaniel did not move for a moment. He stood at the table with his hands flat on the surface and felt something move through him that he did not have a precise name for. Not triumph. Not relief exactly, though there was relief in it. Something older and less clean than either of those things. The feeling of a man who has been bracing against a blow that never landed and is now slowly, carefully standing back up to full height. He turned to Art Pickford first. The old man crossed to him and extended his hand. "Your father would have done the same," Art said. "Probably would have done it better." "I don't know about that," Nathaniel said, but he shook the hand and held it for a moment and meant it completely. Then he turned. Eleanor was standing at the edge of the gallery where she'd sat throughout the hearing, not at the table because she was not a legal party, but present, visible, watching. She had not spoken during the proceedings. She had not needed to. Her presence had done something he couldn't entirely quantify, some quality of steadiness in the room that he'd been aware of the entire time, the way you're aware of solid ground under your feet without consciously thinking about it. He crossed to her. "It's done," he said. "I heard." She looked at the bench where Judge Briggs was already moving to the next matter, unhurried and efficient. He was fair. He was. "That's all you can ask for," she said. "A fair reading." Behind them, Aldridge's lawyers were packing their papers. Aldridge himself was still seated, the man who always moved first, who had spent his entire career setting the pace of things, was sitting still at a table that now meant nothing. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. He had expected to feel something more specific. He had expected anger's particular satisfaction, or the hardness of watching a man who tried to take something from you walk away empty. What he felt instead was almost nothing. Not forgiveness, he wasn't at forgiveness yet, and wasn't sure he'd get there, but something less sharp than anger and more honest than satisfaction. Aldridge looked up. Their eyes met across the room. Nathaniel held his gaze for one long moment. Then he turned away. That was all. They came down the courthouse steps, Nathaniel, Eleanor, Roy, Tobias, Art Pickford, into the cold Montana noon. Roy said, "Does this mean we can celebrate?" "It means we can breathe," Nathaniel said. "Close enough," Roy said. Tobias was grinning broadly, which was not his usual expression, and which looked good on him. Art declined their offer of dinner. Long ride back, wanted to make some ground before dark. He shook hands all around, tipped his hat to Eleanor with the same respect he'd offered her that morning, and rode off the way he'd come. Nathaniel watched him go. "He's a good man," Eleanor said. "The best kind," Nathaniel said. "The kind who does the right thing because it's the right thing and doesn't need it to be more complicated than that." She looked at him sidelong. "Is that how you see yourself?" He thought about it honestly. "Some days. Other days I'm just a man trying to keep his land." Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said. No, he said. They're not. He found Aldridge at the bottom of the courthouse steps on the way out. Not by design, Nathaniel was coming down the others a few paces behind, and Aldridge was there waiting. He had dismissed his lawyers. He had something to say that he intended to say himself. Nathaniel stopped. They were approximately the same height. They had never been this close before, not deliberately, not face to face. Aldridge said, "You got lucky." "I got the right outcome," Nathaniel said. "This time." His voice was even, the voice of a man who has lost a legal argument and intends to frame it as a temporary inconvenience. But that ranch is still carrying more debt than it can service Carter. You won the land today. You're still going to lose it, just slower. Nathaniel looked at him. He thought about everything he could say. He had a great deal available: the smokehouse, the cured meat, the hearing that had just ended, the woman who had made the difference between a ranch that survived and one that didn't. The old man who had ridden 2 days to testify because Nathaniel's father had once been decent when decency cost something. He had all of that. What he said was, "You may be right, but whatever happens to Black River, it'll happen to it honestly. Not because someone decided to take it." Aldridge looked at him. Something moved in his expression, not remorse, but something with a passing resemblance to it. The look of a man who is old enough to understand what he has become, and not entirely pleased with the recognition. He said nothing. He walked away. Nathaniel stood on the courthouse steps and watched him go, with the feeling of something unresolved passing out of his immediate orbit without being resolved, and the understanding that some things didn't get resolved, they just moved on. Eleanor appeared at his shoulder. "What did he say?" she asked. "That the ranch is still in trouble." "Is he right?" Nathaniel thought about it honestly. "Short term, we need a good spring, good cattle prices. The eastern pasture has to produce." "It will," she said. He looked at her. "You sound certain." "I am certain," she said. "Because I know what that land looks like, and I know what you're capable of, and I know what we can build together if we start from an honest foundation." She paused. Aldridge was never building from an honest foundation. That's why he's walking away empty today. Nathaniel watched Aldridge's retreating figure until it turned a corner and was gone. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly why. They had dinner in town, all 4 of them, at the restaurant near the post office that served a beef stew that Roy declared the best he'd ever eaten. They sat around the table and talked about things that were not the hearing and not the smokehouse and not the winter for the first time in weeks, and it was the particular relief of people who have been through something together letting that thing sit down beside them for a moment instead of riding on their backs. Halfway through the meal, a woman at the next table leaned over. She was in her 50s, with the direct gaze of someone who had decided life was too short for indirect approaches. "Pardon me, I was in the courthouse this morning. You're the folks from Black River Ranch." "We are," Nathaniel said. The woman looked at Eleanor, then back at Nathaniel, then at Eleanor again. "The lady there, is she the one who ran your smokehouse?" Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's expression was composed, waiting. "She is," Nathaniel said. The woman nodded slowly. "My husband runs the feed store. He told me about it. Said she rebuilt that smokehouse from nothing, kept it going through the cold snap in October, finished the whole curing season before winter set in hard." She paused. "That's not a small thing out here." "No," Nathaniel said. "It's not." The woman looked at Eleanor directly. "I just wanted to say good work, ma'am. Good hard work." Eleanor looked at her. Something moved in her face, small and real, and the kind of thing that doesn't happen often enough to be ordinary. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." The woman nodded, satisfied, and returned to her own meal. The table was quiet for a moment. Roy said quietly to no one in particular, "I like this town." Nobody argued with him. The ride back to Black River was quieter than the ride in. Not uncomfortably so, the quiet had a different quality now, the released quality of tension that has been resolved. Eleanor rode beside Nathaniel on the wagon bench, her hands in her lap, and her face turned slightly toward the darkening horizon. And Nathaniel had the sense, not for the first time, that there was a great deal happening behind that composed expression that he was only beginning to understand. "You said after the hearing," she said. He looked at her. "You said you wanted to talk about something, after the hearing." He had said that. 4 days ago, standing in the snow outside the smokehouse with everything still uncertain and the hearing still ahead of them, like a wall he didn't know if he could climb. The hearing was behind him now. "Yes," he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, he had known in some form for at least a week. He was quiet because what he wanted to say was important enough to say correctly. "I don't want this to end," he said. She turned to look at him. Her expression was careful, not closed open in the way that meant she was paying full attention. "The smokehouse work is done," he said. "You finished what I hired you to do better than I had any right to expect, and I know the job as I described it is finished." He kept his eyes on the road because it was easier to say the rest of it that way. "But I am asking you, not assuming, asking if there's any part of you that wants to stay. Not for the smokehouse, not for the work or the winter, or because you don't have somewhere else to go. I know you always have somewhere else to go." A pause. "I'm asking if you want to stay because of what's here, what's built here, what I think could be built if we built it together." The wagon moved through the dark and the cold. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "I've been asked to stay places before," she said. "Twice. Once because the man needed someone to keep his house, and once because the man thought he was being kind." A pause. "You're not asking me either of those things." "No," Nathaniel said. "I'm not. You're asking me as a partner." "I'm asking you as someone I respect," he said, "and someone I want beside me. Those two things in that order." She looked at the road ahead for a moment. "I watched you in that courtroom today," she said. "You didn't bluster and you didn't beg and you didn't perform. You just told the truth and let it stand on its own." She paused. "I've been waiting a long time to see someone do that." "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I need an answer," he said quietly. "Not tonight, if you need time. But I need you to know the question is real." She held his gaze across the wagon bench, with the cold around them, and the horses moving steady, and the lights of Black River just beginning to show in the distance. "The question is real," she said. "And so is the answer." He waited. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." The word landed in the cold air between them like something permanent. Like a foundation stone. Like a fire that had just caught and was going to hold. He nodded once. He didn't say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying tonight, and he had learned from her from 3 weeks of watching how she worked and what she valued, that some things were honored best by letting them be exactly what they were without dressing them in more words than they needed. They pulled into the yard at Black River as the last light left the sky. Dale came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He looked at their faces and had the good sense not to ask questions. He crossed the yard toward Eleanor. He stopped in front of her and said, "Fire's holding. I checked it the way you showed me. Temperature's been stable all day." He paused. "I used the hickory from the back stack. Left the front stack for tomorrow." "That's the right call," she said. "The back stack is drier." Dale nodded. He stood there another second working something out. "For what it's worth," he said, "Eleanor, what you did with that smokehouse." He shook his head slightly. "I was wrong about what I thought when you first came. I knew it a week after you got here. I should have said it then." Eleanor looked at him with the even careful gaze she used for things being offered genuinely. "You stacked the wood," she said. "I noticed." Dale blinked. "That was enough," she said. She walked past him toward the smokehouse to check the fire herself, because that was what she did, and would probably always do. Nathaniel, passing Dale on the way to the barn, said quietly, "You did right today." "Managed a fire for 8 hours," Dale said. "Wasn't exactly heroic." "It was exactly what was needed," Nathaniel said. That counts. He went into the barn, and Eleanor went into the smokehouse, pulled open the door, and checked the banked fire. It was exactly where she'd left it. Low-contained, holding steady through the cold. Exactly right. The winter settled in for real the week after the hearing. Not the tentative cold that had been testing the edges of things since October. Not the early frost that caught everyone sideways in the night. This was the full committed weight of a Montana winter arriving at last, covering the valley in snow that wasn't going anywhere until March, and dropping temperatures that made the air feel like something you had to push through rather than simply breathe. Black River Ranch went quiet in the way ranches went quiet in deep winter. Not dead, not still, but turned inward, focused, every resource directed toward the single task of endurance. The cattle were brought in close. The horses were blanketed. The water troughs were checked twice a day. And the smokehouse, its work technically finished its hooks full, and its fire banked to a careful low burn, became the warm center of a property that had very few warm centers left. Eleanor did not leave the smokehouse, not because she couldn't. She had said yes, she had said it plainly on the wagon bench with the cold around them and the lights of the ranch coming into view. And it was real, and she knew it was real, and Nathaniel knew it was real. But the smokehouse was still where she understood herself best. It was where she had built something that mattered, where the work had proven what she'd always known about herself, and never quite been able to make the world acknowledge. She still tended the fire every morning and every evening with the same attention she'd given it when everything depended on it, because the habit of excellence was not something she could simply set aside because the immediate crisis had passed. Nathaniel understood this without being told. He came every morning with 2 cups of coffee. He sat on his crate. They talked. Not about the ranch's finances, though. Those were real and ongoing, and the spring would bring its own tests. Not about the future they'd agreed to, at least not in so many words. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have finally stopped performing for each other and started simply being about small things and large ones, about his father and her father, about Indiana in summer and Montana in winter, about the cattle he hoped to run on the eastern pasture when the season turned, about the recipes she knew for preserved meat and the methods she'd learned that nobody west of Indiana had ever bothered to document. It was Tobias who first said out loud what everyone on the ranch had already understood. He said it to Dale on a Tuesday morning while they were breaking ice on the water troughs in the particular companionable silence that men develop when they've worked alongside each other through something difficult. "Carter's in there every morning," Tobias said. 2 cups. Dale didn't look up from the trough. "I know. You all right with it?" Dale was quiet for a moment, which was his version of thinking carefully. "She told me I stacked the wood," he said. "First person on this ranch ever said anything to me about doing something right without being told to do it." He broke through another patch of ice. "Yeah, I'm all right with it." Tobias nodded. That was all either of them said. The days had a rhythm now that they hadn't had before. Not just the rhythm of winter work, the feeding and watering and checking and repairing, but something underneath that. Something that had to do with the way Eleanor had quietly reorganized the way the ranch thought about itself. She hadn't done it on purpose. She hadn't done it at all exactly. It had happened around her, the way a fire in a hearth reorganizes the behavior of everyone in the room, without actively doing anything except burning. Roy had started writing things down. Not orders, not instructions, observations. The way the cattle moved in cold weather versus mild. The way the east pasture drained compared to the west. The way certain fence posts held better than others depending on how deep they'd been driven. He had a notebook he'd bought in town on a trip he hadn't explained, and he filled it with the kind of careful, curious attention that Eleanor had modeled without ever suggesting he try it. Clement, who had never in his life discussed the future of anything with anyone, asked Nathaniel one evening after supper whether there was any chance of expanding the herd by summer. Nathaniel looked at him. "Where is this coming from?" Clement looked at his coffee. "Eleanor said the east pasture could run twice what we've got. I've been thinking about it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "We'd need capital," he said. "I know," Clement said. "I'm just asking if it's being thought about." It's being thought about, Nathaniel said. Clement nodded and finished his coffee and went to bed, satisfied with the answer. In the way that practical men are satisfied by confirmation that someone is taking the right things seriously. The twist came from the direction nobody had been looking. It came in the form of a letter, another one which arrived on a Thursday in December, not from the Territorial Land Office this time, but from a law firm in Helena. Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table, while Eleanor sat across from him with her hands around a coffee cup and watched his face the way she watched things that were changing while she looked at them. He set the letter down. "What is it?" she asked. "Art Pickford died," he said. She was very still for a moment. "When?" "2 weeks ago. His daughter wrote to the firm handling his estate." Nathaniel looked at the letter again, not reading it, just looking at it. "She found correspondence in his effects that he wanted delivered to me personally after his death. The firm is asking where to send it." "Is it about the boundary?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know yet." He folded the letter and set it aside. But Art was meticulous. Whatever he left, it was intentional. He wrote back to the firm that afternoon. The package arrived 10 days later, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, with Art Pickford's handwriting on the outside in the careful, deliberate script of a man who had learned to write at a time when writing was considered a privilege. Inside was a deed, not to the disputed pasture land. To the northern parcel, the 40 acres that had been Art Pickford's land, the property adjacent to Black River's eastern boundary, the land Art had sold in 1879 when he moved to the county seat. Art Pickford had bought it back. Sometime in the last 5 years, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone, including Nathaniel Art, had tracked down the current owner of his old northern parcel, negotiated a private sale, and registered the deed in his own name. And in his will he had left it to Black River Ranch. The accompanying letter in Art's handwriting was 3 paragraphs long. The first explained what he had done and why that the land was good. Land always had been good land, and that it belonged logically with the Carter property. The second paragraph was shorter. "Your father was a good man. I am glad to have known him. I hope this is useful." The third paragraph was 1 sentence. "Take care of that eastern pasture. It's the best grass in the valley, and you've earned the right to use it." Nathaniel read it twice. Then he set it on the table and said nothing for a long moment. Eleanor, who had read it over his shoulder, also said nothing. She sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him with the full attention she saved for moments that required it. "He knew," Nathaniel said finally. "Before the hearing. He knew he was ill. He'd already arranged this." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "He rode 2 days in the cold to testify, and he already knew." Nathaniel stopped. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not a gesture of performance, just presence. The same way she'd put 2 fingers against his wrist in the courtroom. Just contact. Just "I'm here." He turned his hand over and held hers. 40 acres, he said. "Combined with the eastern pasture, that's enough to run the herd you want," she said. "And more if the spring is good." He looked at her. "You knew he had that land?" "I didn't know," she said. "But I thought about it. When you told me about him, what he said about your father, the winter of 1862, splitting the stores. Men like that don't stop keeping accounts. He was settling something." She paused. "He wanted to be sure the ranch was all right after he was gone." "He told me not to thank him," Nathaniel said. "Then don't," she said. "Bring the ranch through. That's what he asked for." He looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you a proper conversation," he said. "Not on a wagon in the dark, a real one." "About what specifically?" "About the partnership I mentioned, what it actually means, what I'm offering." He paused. "And what I'm hoping you'd want from it, if you were being completely honest about what you need." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Talk." He talked. He told her about the debt first, because it was the thing most people in his position would have hidden, and he refused to hide it from her. He told her exactly what Black River owed who it owed it to, and what the realistic timeline for paying it looked like, given the cured stores, the eastern pasture, and now the 40 acres from Art Pickford's estate. He told her what a good spring would look like, and what a bad spring would look like, and what the difference meant in practical terms. She listened without interrupting. When he finished the financial part, he stopped. She said, "Now tell me what you actually mean by partnership." He looked at her directly. "Equal standing. Your name on the decisions that matter. Your knowledge as the foundation of what we build, not an afterthought to it. The smokehouse becomes a real operation, not just winter preservation. You mentioned methods that nobody west of Indiana had documented. I want to change that. I want it to be something people come here for." He paused. "And I want you to be here. Not as an employee, not as a hand, as the person this place belongs to, the same way it belongs to me." The quiet that followed had weight. Eleanor set her coffee cup down. She looked at the table for a moment, then up at him, and her expression had the quality of someone who has been offered something they had genuinely stopped expecting to be offered. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me." "I have been useful to people my entire life," she said. "Hired for my usefulness, valued for my usefulness, kept around for my usefulness. And when I stopped being immediately useful, or when something about me became inconvenient, the valuing stopped." She met his eyes. "I am not saying you are those people. I am saying I have heard things that sounded like what you just said before, from men who meant them in the moment, and stopped meaning them when circumstances changed." He held that. "What would it take," he said carefully, "for you to believe that I mean it beyond the moment?" She thought about that for a long time. Long enough that the lamp between them flickered once and steadied. "Time," she said. "Not promises, time. And the kind of consistency that doesn't depend on things going well." "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's why I said yes on the wagon. Not because of what you said, because of what I'd already seen." "Then we start from there," he said. She nodded. "We start from there." The twist nobody saw coming was Dale Pruitt. It happened on a Sunday toward the end of January, on the kind of gray, featureless afternoon, when winter had been going on long enough that it had stopped feeling like a season and started feeling like a permanent condition. Nathaniel was in the house going over the ledger. The numbers were better than they'd been in 3 years, and he was trying not to trust that too completely when he heard raised voices from the direction of the smokehouse. He went out. Dale was standing outside the smokehouse door. Eleanor was in the doorway. Neither was shouting. The raised voice had already resolved into something quieter, but the quality of the air between them was charged. He did not go closer. He stayed by the barn and watched. He could not hear what they were saying. He saw Dale's posture, the tight, hunched quality of it, the particular way a man holds himself when something is trying to get out that he's been keeping in. He saw Eleanor's stillness, which was not the stillness of discomfort, but of someone paying very close attention to something that requires it. Dale said something. Eleanor said something back. Dale turned away, one hand going to the back of his neck, which was what he did when he was trying to get his face under control. Eleanor waited. After a moment, Dale turned back. He said something else. Eleanor nodded and stepped back from the doorway, and Dale went in. Nathaniel went back to the ledger. He asked her about it that evening when the rest of the hands were at supper. What happened with Dale today? She was quiet for a moment. He came to apologize. A real one, not the wood-stacking kind. He looked at her. He told me he had a sister, she said. Heavier than me, older. She died 3 winters ago, some illness that he thought she might have gotten through faster if people had taken her seriously sooner. If doctors had looked past her size and seen a sick woman instead of what they expected to see. She paused. He said that when I first came, he looked at me and saw what happened to her. Not me, her. And he was angry at me for it, which he knows doesn't make any sense. Nathaniel was quiet. He cried, she said. A little. He would hate that I'm telling you that. I won't say anything. I know. She looked at the fire. He's a good man underneath the places where he's been hurt. Nathaniel thought about that. You said yes to that pretty fast. I'm good at seeing it, she said simply, because I've needed people to see it in me. He looked at her for a long moment. You are extraordinary, he said. Plain. Not a compliment performing itself, just a fact he was tired of not saying directly. She looked at him. Her expression was careful in the way she received things that landed somewhere she'd kept protected for a long time. I'm experienced, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, he said. She almost smiled. She actually smiled this time. Small and real and aimed directly at him. No, she said. They're not. Eleanor began documenting her methods in January. It was Roy who gave her the idea without meaning to. He mentioned his notebook one evening, the observations he'd been keeping, and she looked at him with that focused expression she used when something had caught her attention. The next day, she asked Nathaniel if there was writing paper in the house, and when he brought her 3 sheets, she looked at them and said quietly, I'm going to need more than that. He brought her a full ream. She wrote for 2 hours every evening after the fire was settled for the night. Not diary entries, she was not a diary-keeping person. She wrote methods, process notes. The precise sequence for brining a 100-pound cut, the specific temperatures for different stages of hickory, smoking the signs that told you a batch was curing correctly versus the signs that told you something had gone wrong in the first 24 hours when it could still be corrected. She wrote about what Gus had done wrong without naming him. She had figured it out from the residue in the firebox and the old brine marks on the walls, and what the corrected approach looked like and why. She wrote everything her father had taught her in Indiana in a smokehouse that had run for 22 years without a single batch lost. Nathaniel read the first pages on a Thursday evening. He read them standing up because he'd picked them up meaning to glance at them and then couldn't put them down. Eleanor, he said. These are extraordinary. She turned and looked at him with the expression she used when she had been given a compliment she was deciding whether to accept. They're accurate, she said. They're more than accurate. There are ranchers from here to the territorial border who lose meat every winter because nobody taught them what you knew when you were 10 years old. He held up the pages. This changes that. She looked at him for a long moment. That was the idea, she said quietly. He set the pages down carefully. When you're ready to share it, I want to help you, however that looks. Whether it's a pamphlet or teaching, or I don't know yet what the right form is. But this matters beyond us. Eleanor turned back to the stove. He could not see her face, but he saw the way her shoulders changed very slightly, the way someone's posture changes when they have heard something they needed to hear and decided to let themselves have it without arguing. All right, she said. The neighbor came on a Wednesday in late January. His name was Carl Fisher, 12 miles southeast of Black River, running a smaller operation for 8 years, a decent man, without being anything more than that. He rode in looking like a man who had been riding hard and thinking harder, and he asked to speak to Carter. Nathaniel came out. Fisher said, I heard you had someone who knew about meat preservation, smokehouse work. Where'd you hear that? Woman in town. Said there was a woman at Black River who rebuilt a smokehouse from nothing and ran it through the cold snap in October and saved the whole operation. Fisher's jaw was tight, in the way jaws were tight when a man needed something and didn't like needing it. I've got 40 pounds of cured pork that I think has gone wrong. I don't know if it's spoiled or just off, and if it's spoiled and my family eats it. Come on, Nathaniel said. He took Fisher to Eleanor. She listened to his description, how it had been cured, the smokehouse setup, when it went in, what it smelled and looked like now, with the same full attention she gave everything. Then she asked him 3 specific questions about the brine ratio, the wood he'd used, and the ventilation situation. Bring me a sample, she said. The smallest cut you're concerned about. Fisher looked at her. You can tell from a sample. I can tell you within 10 minutes whether it's safe to eat, she said. And if it's not, I can tell you why, so you don't make the same error next year. Fisher rode back to his property, returned within 2 hours with a sample, and waited in the yard while Eleanor examined it. She came out 15 minutes later. It's safe, she said. The surface coloration concerned you, but that's a reaction to the wood. You had some green mixed in with the dry, and the composition of the smoke affected the exterior. The interior cure is sound." She paused. "Your firebox temperature was running low in the second week. If you'd had a better draft, it would have corrected. Next year, here's what you do." She told him, all of it, clearly and without holding anything back. Fisher stood in the cold and listened with the attention of a man who has been frightened for his family's lives and is now being given something real. When she finished, he said, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said. He shook his head. "Ma'am, you just told me my family isn't going to get sick this winter. That's worth—" "Tell people," she said. "If you know ranchers who are losing meat to bad curing, tell them there are better methods. That's worth more to me than money." Fisher looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing because there was nothing to add. Fisher rode out. At the gate, he stopped and turned back. "Carter," he said. "Fisher. You're a lucky man." Nathaniel looked at Eleanor, who had already turned back toward the smokehouse. "Yes," he said, "I am." Fisher was not the last neighbor to come. Over the remaining weeks of winter, 3 others made the trip to Black River with questions about curing methods, smokehouse setup, brine formulas. Eleanor answered all of them fully without gatekeeping. In the same spirit, she wrote her methods each evening, because knowledge that sat in one person's head and went no further was not doing the work it was capable of doing. Nathaniel mentioned it to her one evening. "You know you could charge for this," he said. "I know," she said, "and you're choosing not to." "For now," she said. "When it becomes something more formal, when we have documentation worth selling, when there's a real operation here worth pointing people toward, then yes. But right now what I'm building is reputation. And reputation doesn't cost anything to give away. It comes back to you in ways money doesn't." He looked at her. "Your father teach you that too?" "No," she said. "That one I learned the hard way." He did not ask her to elaborate, but he remembered it. On the worst night of the cold, when the temperature fell so far that Nathaniel woke at 2 in the morning with the feeling that something required his attention, he dressed and went to the smokehouse. Eleanor was already at the firebox. She had added wood 40 minutes before the temperature inside had stabilized. The cured meat was fine. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He sat on his crate. She handed him a cup of coffee she had made too. He held it and looked at her in the lamplight. This woman who had arrived at his gate in October, with a mended coat and a lifetime of knowledge and a quality of stillness in her face that had taken him 3 weeks to understand, was not passivity, but something far more difficult to achieve. "I want to register the partnership formally," he said, "before spring, with the territorial office. Your name on the property." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to offer," she said. "I know what it is," he said. "That's why I'm offering it now in February, when nothing is easy and nothing is certain, and you'd have every reason to think I was doing it because things were going well." He looked at her steadily. "I'm doing it because it's right, because you earned it, and because I don't want there to be any ambiguity about what you are to this ranch and to me." The fire burned between them. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. "My father always said," she began and then stopped. "What did he say?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "He said that the only promises worth making are the ones you make when it's hard to make them." She looked at Nathaniel. "February is hard." "Yes," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Register the partnership." He nodded. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The fire did what it had always done, burned low and steady, and exactly where it needed to be, the way it had since the first night Eleanor Whitaker had walked into an abandoned smokehouse with nothing but a rusty key and a lifetime of knowledge, and decided that the bones were good and the work was worth doing. Outside, the Montana winter pressed on. Inside, the fire held, and for the first time in 4 years since Margaret's death, since the slow unraveling began, since the credit line and the empty smokehouse, and the hands who quit, and the land dispute that was supposed to finish. What time had started? Nathaniel Carter sat in a warm room beside a steady fire next to a woman who had chosen to stay, not because she had to, but because she had decided this place was worth staying for. He did not take that lightly. He intended never to take it lightly. The lamp burned low. The snow fell outside soft and steady over a ranch that was going to make it. Spring came to Black River Ranch the way it came to most places in Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in argument with the winter that had held everything in its grip for 5 months. There were warm days followed by hard freezes mud that thawed and refroze and thawed again. Mornings that smelled like green coming through, and afternoons that reminded you not to get ahead of yourself. Nathaniel registered the partnership on the 14th of February. He did not make a ceremony of it. He rode into town with Eleanor beside him. On the wagon bench, went to the Territorial Records Office, signed the documents in front of the clerk, and watched while the clerk copied Eleanor Whitaker's name onto the deed for Black River Ranch in his careful official hand. The clerk looked up when he was done. He looked at Eleanor, then at Nathaniel, then back at Eleanor with the expression of a man rearranging his expectations in real time and finding the process mildly startling. "Congratulations," he said. He seemed to mean it. "Thank you," Eleanor said. On the way out, she held the door for an older woman coming in behind her, and the woman glanced at the documents Eleanor was carrying and then at her face and said, "You're the woman from Black River, the one who saved that smokehouse." Eleanor looked at her. "I'm from Black River," she said. "Yes." The woman reached out and took her hand and held it for a moment with the direct, uncomplicated warmth of someone who has decided that a stranger deserves to know she is seen. "Good for you, honey," the woman said. "Good for you." Eleanor held herself very still for just 1 second. Then she said, "Thank you," and meant it with every part of herself. In the wagon on the way back, she didn't say anything for a while. Nathaniel didn't push. He had learned over these months when Eleanor's silences wanted company, and when they wanted to be left alone to finish themselves. This one finished itself after about a mile. "That woman didn't know anything about me," Eleanor said. "She just knew the story." "That's enough," Nathaniel said. "It shouldn't be," she said. "Knowing a story about someone isn't the same as knowing them." "No," he said, "but it's a start. It's people choosing to see something other than what they assume." She was quiet again for a moment. "My father would have liked it here," she said. It was a different kind of statement than anything she'd said before, not about the ranch, not about the work, but about herself and the history she carried and where that history had finally brought her. "Tell me about him," Nathaniel said. She did. She talked for most of the ride back. Not in the careful, measured way she talked about methods and processes, but in the loose, unhurried way that people talk about someone they loved and lost and have not had enough occasions to talk about. Her father's name was James. He had come to Indiana from Virginia when he was 22, with a set of tools and a recipe book, and the stubborn certainty of a man who knew what he was good at. He had been a large man, big-shouldered, broad-handed, the kind of large that people read as strength before they read it as anything else. He had taught her everything and loved her without reservation, and died when she was 23 without ever quite understanding why the world treated her differently than it treated him. "He thought if I was good enough at the work," she said, "people would see past the rest." "He wasn't wrong," Nathaniel said. "He was slow," she said, not bitterly, just accurately. "It took a lot of being good enough before anyone noticed. And some people never did." "I noticed," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "Late," he added. "I want to be honest about the late." "You noticed," she said. "That's the part that counts." They pulled into the yard at Black River to find all 4 hands waiting at the barn, not lined up, not formal about it, just there, the way people ended up in a place when something was happening that they felt they ought to be present for. Dale said, "How'd it go?" Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor said, "It's done. The deed's registered." Tobias said, "So that's official." "That's official," she said. There was a pause that had warmth in it, which was something pauses on a working ranch did not usually have. Clement said, "Supper's going to be late because Roy forgot to put the beans on." Roy said, "I got distracted." "By what?" Dale said. I was writing something down, Roy said, slightly defensive. Nobody made fun of him for it. Which was its own kind of change from the ranch that had existed in October. It was a Thursday morning in late April when Nathaniel Carter said the thing he had been building toward since October. Not in the smokehouse, not by the fire. He said it in the east pasture, where they had walked out together to check on the new grass in the early morning when the day hadn't fully declared itself. Eleanor crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the ground. Still cool, still damp from the night, but green. Genuinely, unmistakably green in a way that meant the season had committed itself. "It's going to be a good year," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She stood and looked at him. He was already looking at her. She had learned over these months to read the specific quality of his attention when he was working through something, when he had worked through something and reached a conclusion, and when he had decided he was done, being careful about something altogether. This was the third kind. "Nathaniel," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I want to ask you properly. Not in a wagon in the dark, not in the middle of something else. Here." He paused. "Will you marry me?" The east pasture was very quiet. A long moment passed, the kind that has weight, because what comes after it will change the shape of everything. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to stay differently." She looked at him. The man who had stood outside a general store in October and almost made a different choice. Who had sat on a wooden crate beside a fire every morning for 5 months and asked real questions and listened to real answers. Who had put her name on a deed in February because it was right, not because it was easy, and who had said her father's name belonged on the acknowledgement page without pausing to think about it. "Yes," she said. Just that. Clean and complete and without reservation. He took a breath. She looked at him with the expression she'd been slowly learning to let herself have, the one that wasn't careful, that didn't protect anything, that simply said, "I am here, and I am glad to be here, and I have stopped waiting for the reason it won't last." "Good," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "Good." She took his hand. They stood in the east pasture in the April morning on land that had been contested and defended, and was now by every measure that mattered theirs. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that the moment wasn't already saying for them. The smokehouse documentation was finished in March, and the pamphlet was printed in May. 200 copies bound in light blue covers that the printer's wife had chosen because she said a woman's work deserved to be seen from across the room. Eleanor held the first copy for a long time before she opened it. On the acknowledgement page in the printer's clean type, it read, "In memory of James Whitaker, who taught everything that follows. With gratitude to Nathaniel Carter, who gave the work a place to matter." She ran her thumb across her father's name. Nathaniel stood beside her and did not say anything, because some moments did not need words added to them. The letter from Billings had arrived in April from a woman named Margaret Doyle, who ran a practical journal circulating among ranching families in the territory. She had heard about the Black River smokehouse documentation from Fisher, who had apparently been telling the story to everyone he encountered. She wanted to publish excerpts. She wanted to interview Eleanor directly. She wanted, in her own words, to make sure the women of this territory understood that the methods and the knowledge and the history belonged to them as much as to the men who usually wrote these things down. Eleanor had taken the letter into the smokehouse and stood beside the fire with it for an hour. When Nathaniel found her, she was sitting on her stool with her hands in her lap. "Roy told me," he said. She looked up. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that my father spent 22 years doing this work," she said, "and nobody wrote a single word about it. He was good, and he was honest, and he knew more about this trade than most men who got written about, and he died, and the knowledge almost died with him." She paused. "And then I came here, and you gave me a key." Her voice was level. What was behind it was not. "You're going to write back to her," he said. "Yes. And your father's name will be on it." "And your name," she said quietly. "If that's all right. The man who gave a woman the chance to do the work." He thought about the bench outside the general store. A woman sitting in the cold, reading his notice, folding it, and holding it out to him when he stopped. The 2 seconds he had stood there and almost said something different. The particular grace of having made by some instinct better than he usually gave himself credit for the right choice. "That's all right," he said. Roy said it at supper a week after the proposal, when everyone at the table already knew, because Eleanor wore a ring, and Nathaniel had stopped finding reasons not to stand close to her in the yard. Roy said it to Dale quietly, but not quietly enough. "You know what I've been thinking about," Roy said. "No," Dale said. "That first day, when she came, you said—" Roy stopped. "You know what you said?" Dale looked at his plate. "I know what I said. And now she's half owner of the place. She's got a publication in Billings writing about her methods. She's marrying the boss and ranchers are riding 12 miles to ask her questions." Roy shook his head slowly. "We almost missed all of this. Over something that had nothing to do with anything." Dale was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said. "People are idiots," Roy said, without judgment, just as an observation. "Yes," Dale said. "We are." Nathaniel, who had heard all of it, looked across the table at Eleanor, who had also heard it, and was looking at her coffee, with the small private expression of a woman who has been through enough to find a specific peace in the acknowledgement of how much almost went wrong. She caught his eye. He shook his head slightly. She smiled. And supper continued around a table at a ranch that was whole. The summer came, and the east pasture produced exactly what Clement had predicted. The additional stock thrived. The pamphlet's second printing was ordered in June, the third in August. Fisher, true to his word, had told everyone he knew, and those people had told everyone they knew, and the name Eleanor Whitaker had begun to travel through the territory in the way that names travel when attached to something genuinely useful, not with fanfare, but with the steady accumulation of one person telling another, until the name was simply part of the common knowledge of a place. Ranchers came to Black River. Purposeful visits planned in advance with questions prepared and notebooks ready. Eleanor answered every question. She taught the way her father had taught her directly, without condescension, assuming intelligence in the person across from her, giving the benefit of the doubt. Nathaniel watched her do this and thought sometimes about Thomas Aldridge, not with anger, but with something closer to wonder. At the particular human failure of looking at a person and seeing only what you expect to see. At how much Aldridge had missed by looking at Eleanor Whitaker and seeing a woman he could dismiss. He thought about himself in that first moment outside the general store. The 2 seconds. The old reflex. He thought about what it had cost him nothing to do and what it would have cost him everything not to. On a Thursday evening in late September, 1 year, almost exactly from the morning, Eleanor had arrived at Black River with a mended coat and a bag she'd carried from Indiana. Nathaniel found her in the smokehouse. Not tending the fire, not writing. Just standing near the hooks where the first new curing batch of the season was going, pressing her palm flat against the wall. "Checking for a pulse?" he asked. She smiled. A full one, not the small careful ones she'd given in those first 3 weeks. The kind of smile that belonged to a woman who had decided to stop rationing joy. "Good bones," she said. He came to stand beside her. "Good bones," he agreed. She turned and looked at him fully, the way she looked at things when she was finished being careful and ready to simply see. "I used to wonder," she said, "what it would feel like to be somewhere I was actually wanted, not needed, not useful." She paused. "Wanted." He looked at her. "And," he said. She looked around the smokehouse, the repaired firebox, the straight-hanging rods, the walls that held the memory of 5 months of work that had mattered, the vent she'd adjusted with a curved piece of metal, and a square of dark cotton, and knowledge that nobody else in the territory had thought to write down until she did. Then she looked at him. "It feels like this," she said. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. Outside, the first cold of the new season was beginning to settle across the valley. The cattle were moving toward shelter. The east pasture that had been contested and defended and finally secured was going quiet under a sky already thinking about winter. But the smokehouse fire was burning. It would keep burning through this winter and the next, through the springs and summers that followed through every year that Black River Ranch continued to grow into the kind of place people pointed to when they talked about what was possible, when a man finally chose to look past his assumptions, and a woman finally received the chance she had always deserved. The fire burned because Eleanor Whitaker tended it. Eleanor Whitaker stayed because Nathaniel Carter had looked at what she could do, truly looked past every reflex that told him to look elsewhere, and had understood without being told that what she was capable of was not a surprise to be discovered. It was simply who she had always been. And that every bit of it, the key and the fire, and the deed and the name on the pamphlet and the ring on her finger, and the smoke rising clean and steady into the Montana sky, that was enough. That was everything.